My name is Tracee Haupt, and I will be moderating this panel. I am joined by Giulia, Carla, Rossi from the British Library, and Tegan, Pyke from Cardiff Metropolitan University, and they will be talking about their presentation, New Media Writing Prize Collection. I'm also joined by Natalie, Kane from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and Stephen McConnachie from the British Film Institute, and they will be talking on preserving and sharing Born Digital Report. And then last but not least, I'm joined by Bostjan Spetic from the Computer Museum in Ljubljana, and he will be talking about the proposal of a new microformat for deep archiving of the web, which he worked on with his colleague Borut Kumperscak. And to start off, I'm going to ask the panelists to please give a short summary of their presentation, which we will follow with a Q&A. And let's go in order, starting with Juliana and Tegan.
Thank you, Tracee. So yeah, it's a brief kind of overview. Mine and Tegan's presentation is about the work done by UK legal deposit libraries around emerging formats and the New Media Writing Prize collection in the UK Web Archive in particular. So emerging formats is the term that we use to refer to born digital publication, whose formats haven't really standardized, and whose structure is more complex than what the libraries are currently capable of collecting at scale. The UK legal deposit libraries have been researching and building experimental collections of emerging formats for the past 5 years. Including curated collections of web-based interactive narratives in the UK Web Archive. So the New Media Writing Prize collection is one of these collections, and also the result of a collaborative project with Bournemouth University to collect copies of all shortlisted and winning entries to the New Media Writing Prize since its launch, using different web archiving tools. And Tegan carried out quality assurance for the New Media Writing Prize collection as part of a PhD placement in 2021 with the British Library. And she kind of formulated a set of quality assurance criteria that are based around literary elements identified in all New Media Writing Prize entries, and then used those criteria to evaluate the captures. And these criteria were kind of applied regardless of the format or the tool used to create a publication, and kind of focused on evaluating things like retention of narrative, theme, and atmosphere for every piece. And these criteria can also be applied more widely to other collections of interactive narratives and electronic literature. And together with the recommendation that Tegan included in her report, we hope that they can help us further our research on collecting and providing access to as well emerging formats.
Thank you. Natalie and Stephen, would you like to go next?
Hi, so I'm Natalie, Kane from the V&A, and together with Stephen and also a team that was made up from by Dr. John McKim from Wechat, and also with our other technical co-I, Richard Palmer, and our research fellow, Dr. Gabby Aragoni, and also with technical support from Tom Ensign. We led a project which is very much looking kind of at the sort of technical challenges and the collections challenges, but also really looking at the born kind of problems that we face in collections, looking at born digital and hybrid objects within the national collection. So the national collection is kind of looking at sector-wide problems at collecting these type of objects. And we were trying to kind of look at sort of strategic priorities and trying to lay the foundations for future research of these kind of problems. So we wanted to essentially create a series of case studies, a data model, a decision model, but also a series of recommendations that the sector might be able to work on, looking around this kind of material. It was the 4 case studies had quite a deep kind of large breadth of type of materials. So we did look at things like VR, so a project with BFI that Stephen and his team worked on. 2 apps within the collection, which was within the V&A, one within the V&A collection, one was speculative. One was Why Stop, which is a community-based app around police stop and search, and one was Instagram, which kind of multiple parts for that. And one was a series of CGI computer-generated assets. And this generated the report Preserving and Sharing Born Digital and Hybrid Objects from across the National Collection, which really aim to understand what the constituent parts of these objects might be and how we might aim to start looking at complexities of these and understand what born digital objects are. And from this, the decision model was generated through a series of workshops and interviews with specialists around collections and curatorial and conservation professionals. I'm going to hand over to Stephen just now to kind of talk broadly around the decision model, which is what we presented in the talk and with the paper.
So the decision model was really my main area of focus and the outputs from the project. And I worked with Tom Ensom, a time-based media conservator who does a lot of work with the Tate and others. And we really attempted to try and to turn the case studies and the workshops into a kind of structural representation of the thought processes and decision-making processes that practitioners would have to go through during the acquisition of these complex objects. And we tried to really break it into categories. And then within each category, we tried to identify the main questions that would be predicted to arise during an acquisition assessment. And we didn't always find extremely clear, concrete answers to every question, but we tried to model a flow of decision-making through to probably an acquisition of the object or some risk flags that our organizations should consider. And during the modeling, we really paid a lot of attention to concepts of risk and tolerance to risk within an organization. And we really paid attention to what you might have to document as perhaps compromises or perhaps uncertainties around your acquisition decision making. And we tried to use process flow modeling like BPMN and flowchart concepts to try and describe decisions that were either binary or slightly more complex than that. And so yeah, we incorporated it in the project report with a set of limitations that we fessed up to in the project, and some areas where we felt it could be developed. We tried to distill a hugely broad set of case studies into quite a narrow output. So we tried to indicate where it could be developed to absorb more complexity and be more granular. I think that's probably enough to summarize that.
Yeah, and the key thing that came from the report and looking at the decision model was obviously we wanted to open up to more experimental collecting that had these resource models that are attached and value models that would be developed in institutions. And the key thing also was trying to understand things like the approach of understanding things like big tech heritage. So it's these bigger companies, and then might be these expanded understanding about how and what born digital objects might be for as we try to approach new understandings of corporate and legal models and all the kind of implications that might come when we think about things like risk, for instance, and things like collaborative stewardship models as a way of thinking about collections as well. So there's a lot of things that kind of came out of the report, but I think we tried to find a way of modelling it through a decision model. And there was also another data model around the catalogue, which we didn't go so much into within this particular presentation, but is attached to that, that we can maybe discuss another time, but is attached to that if you're interested in catalogue models as well. So that's really.
Okay, Bostjan, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Tracee. At Computer History Museum in Slovenia, we work, amongst other things, a lot in acquiring relevant websites with special impact for the local community. And we realized that in acquiring these web-native hybrid objects, there's many issues. We have to collaborate with the original owners and sysadmins and stuff, and collect, do the assessment and acquire them correctly. But then, when we started to ask ourselves how to exhibit this now, we realized that ultimately we want to do a complete reconstruction, publish it back to the web, and as original state as it was, because only then we are definitely comfortable that we have all the assets, all the knowledge required that was required to build the original object. So and basically restoring it, which is fun and full of pitfalls. But the in the last stage, after publishing the reconstruction, we realized there's no good way of labeling it now. And we stumbled upon an idea of microformat, which is popular in other areas of the online, in other online industries, to basically promote collaboration, to promote whatever it is that you're presenting. So every website has a microformat announcing to the sitemap, so that the search engine can find the information on it. We're proposing that whenever somebody is exhibiting a what I call deep archive, or this hybrid born digital object, we should mark it as such so that it's human readable and machine readable as well, that this is a different type of a web property for researchers to be able to discover them globally, to collaborate on them. Who knows? Microformats open possibilities for collaboration across industries and institutions.
Okay, thank you for those helpful recaps. I want to remind the audience to please post any questions you have in the Q&A tab. I see we've already got a few. But to start off, I'm just going to ask a few questions just to get the ball rolling. Starting with Giulia and Tegan, you did an excellent job of explaining why complete isn't always possible due to the many challenges of capturing web objects. And you described judging captures on the basis of narrative, theme, and atmosphere. Can you describe in more detail how you defined a passing capture as it applies specifically to theme and atmosphere, elements which, as you point out, may have many components, some of which might have been captured and others not?
I think I can take over this one. Yeah. So one of the difficulties I encountered, especially using literary elements as the weighing scale, is that it can be subjective in a lot of ways. So going through, I took in consideration for what was possible for a final capture as well. If there were some elements that would never be able to be included, I removed these from the consideration, and it was then observing whether they had a constant intact or close enough to the atmosphere or the theming that was established. It's something that I think definitely needs looking into because it is subjective in that way. What I think is complete or readable might not be readable for other people. So there is a lot of going between the live version where there were live versions of the site and the captured version to weigh up where I felt it fell on the scale. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Natalie and Stephen, you mentioned networks of care and working with communities of creation and preservation, as well as the possibilities of collaborative stewardship. Could you speak more about these types of partnerships and how they might work in the future at your institution?
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's very much an Annette Decker idea, who talked specifically around the people who are already looking after this stuff already. So people who are looking after legacy technologies and creating kind of these great people who are kind of reinvigorating old computer games or old Minitel networks, for instance, is one of the areas of preservation that I'm personally really fascinated by, is people who are kind of creating old France telecom networks to try and reinvigorate the 3615 kind of networks. They can find out what would previously existed there. But obviously there is this interesting legal or kind of problem very much around how that comes into institutions and the kind of legal frameworks that have to exist, or even the kind of the boundaries across in terms of the terms and conditions. And we did raise this a bit in the report around a good problem there is with things like jailbreaking in iPhones, for instance, and reinvigorate kind of trying to acquire things like the iPhone iOS when the agreements, if you're trying to jailbreak those, means that you cross over Apple's terms and conditions about what you're able to preserve and what you're able to bring in. Because Martina Heidvogel in the kind of as a great blog post that she wrote about her time conserving that, or trying to conserve the iPhone at SF MoMA, and she spoke about the fact they tried to take on the I think it's 3.014 or something. Don't quote me on the particular edition. Tried to bring it on, and by them trying to do that, they broke up as they would have to work with someone external to the museum who'd been doing it very successfully, or to a degree try to do it through getting that edition off of a repository. Borut, when I found by doing that, you broke the terms and services of Apple's conditions, which is a very hairy territory for a museum to do, and to do that within a structure that would pass any sort of due diligence. And that means that we have to either negotiate a new form of policy or a new kind of agreement that we would have to do with bigger companies. And that's kind of what I was referring to in terms of big tech heritage. And actually, it's a bigger problem that expands into our agreements in the same way that you have legal deposit libraries for literature, or in other places there are ones that are trialing around video games, for instance. We need to be thinking about these bigger policy changes that we need to perhaps be petitioning to think about what other heritage needs to be kind of passed over or handed over to ensure that we can acquire things successfully without crossing these. But there are lots of lessons we can learn from these smaller communities of people who are, actually they're bigger than we think a lot of the time, who are kind of preserving our heritage already. We've seen this throughout this conference in many ways, and there are people who are doing it and responding very quickly to doing that online all the time. But there's a lot of legal, I keep thinking about the factors that we have issues with, like signing singular people's deed of gifts over, and that causes problems within museums. And I think that we need to slightly change that. The point about collaborative stewardship is more, I think, perhaps around the fact that a lot of collecting institution policies tend to be quite inflexible sometimes around the types of material that we acquire. And maybe Stephen can speak to that around the specific case study that we were talking about. Do you want to speak about that, Stephen?
Sure. So for me, this question really speaks to the idea of what you must collect to collect something. And I think previously, because objects have been modest in their complexity, it was quite achievable to collect a single thing and consider that to be done. You've done your job. But I think the complexity of these objects means that you can make a matrix. In fact, we have made a matrix around video games for, you can collect many things to collect the thing. And that matrix of types of object means that to collect for example, to collect a video game may mean that your organization collects 1 point on the matrix, or 2 or 3, perhaps a video game walkthrough. And then another organization may collect another kind of exemplary type of object for the video game. And it's quite possible to imagine a video game, if it's important enough and rich enough, being collected by several institutions for several purposes within their own collection policy and mandate. So this is kind of a new thing. I think this idea of the BFI National Archive collecting one representation, and perhaps the V&A collecting a separate representation, and maybe a computer history museum collecting a third. I think that matrix-based collecting naturally lends itself to a collective stewardship model, but the implications for collections policy and donor agreements and legal assignment of ownership of objects is unsolved, I think. So I think we're just starting to open the possibilities of this kind of complex object, and therefore complex relationships for collecting organizations resulting. So I don't think we have any answers coming out of the case studies, but they definitely open the questions quite clearly.
Thank you. The next question is for Bostjan and Borut. Your presentation discusses the idea of deep archiving for the web. Can you talk a little bit more about how you define deep archiving and what that means for the Computer Museum?
Sure. Thank you. So similar to what Stephen is describing, these objects that are behind a website, there's typically code, there's typically database. Sometimes there's a dedicated hardware that this was running on. Sometimes there are, in one of the cases that we had, which was a citizen journalism video media site, we even acquired boxes of videotapes, and they all belong to this same piece, this same website that was impactful in the society for a couple of years. You can't tell a story of certain elections in Slovenia without knowing that website, and that website went silent. It went offline. The domain got squatted. Even the domain is part of that object, essentially. So yeah, acquiring all of that and is step one, and then putting it all together in a replica so that it works again as it used to work. In a perfect world, you acquire a server that has everything still on it. You put it back online and it just works. We actually have a case of that as well. But that is really rare. Typically, you have to intervene into the code and you have to document what interventions you had to do to make it run on a modern environment. It's even just introducing secure HTTPS into the internet today breaks a lot of old code. Discontinuing Flash breaks experience of a lot of websites. So I think documenting all the pieces plus all the changes required to keep it alive, for me, is like the pinnacle. And the minimum, we also ask ourselves, what's the minimum? And I think the minimum is just textual description of the inputs and outputs, what the users could put into the software and what did they get out. I wasn't aware of the work of the guys, but I think the video game walkthrough recording is an excellent example of an object that also correctly captures it's an adequate acquisition of a video game, actually. And each of these pieces could tell a broader story. But yeah, having more than one introduces annoying complexities.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is a more general question to multiple people on the panel. Anyone can answer. In our panel, we have several people representing museums. So a general question for panelists working in museums. Do you think that there are unique challenges or opportunities associated with presenting web archives in the context of a museum and thinking of web archives as museum objects?
Oh yeah, I think there's if I may, one obvious opportunity I think is that these websites had a place. They still have some kind of ranking in the society. People know of them. They can be actually an audience acquisition vehicle. They're advertising on the web for the museum and for this idea of preservation, which I think is important.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some interesting conversation about that with one of the case studies is Zeitgeist has a website as part of this group acquisition, and within that website there is a multiple kind of parts process in how that kind of there's the understanding of hierarchy and how that website was understood as part of the group acquisition is quite interesting for us to think about, because that they have the website, which is they don't see as being different to the film that was then produced as part of that website. That's just part of the whole thing as how they understood it. So it wasn't just seen as like a thing to advertise the work on. It's much part of the process as anything else. So it's for us to think about as a design object rather than anything else is quite a good thing for us to test our collections policy by. That was quite interesting for us. But we've also got an acquisition trade at the moment that I'm currently working on. I can't say specifically what it is because of the fact that we're working on it, but the domain name, for instance, and the way that it works is specifically tied to the name of the work, for instance. And there's a lot of things that we are currently working at as an institution that often has a very specific way of how we understand design within an institution. This is where a lot of the project, for instance, that we were working on is how often kind of the collecting policy shapes and how often the curatorial policy ties into kind of conservation necessity, like kind of decisions. And I think there's this kind of shaping of it's interesting what Tegan was saying about like kind of what the different kind of what the essence of the work is. Is that kind of what you mentioned, Tegan, in terms of like what is the thing? But I don't know, I think we have a number of websites that have just been kind of collected now on the V&A, and we're kind of which have been attached to projects as part of like, I don't know, almost the story or the narrative of that thing. So we have the Extinction Rebellion website now. We have project archives of various things, but they are taken on as design and very specifically and as part of a one object centered thing. But I think we're starting to now build up a different sort of framework around those things that I think is different to how perhaps maybe a web archive would function as like we need to collect everything and all of everything. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but that's maybe driven more by our policy than anything else.
It does make sense. Thank you. I'm going to now transition to asking some audience questions, and we have some excellent questions from Megan Lyon. This question's for Tegan and Giulia. Megan writes, I love Tegan's explanations for capture failure, especially inherent interconnection. Web-based works designed to use the web as a platform. I think we see issues a lot in the archives where a page formatting is missing, but the site appears well archived based on the logs. So now I'd like to go about trying to determine if the website is using an externally hosted style sheet. How do you make these discoveries? What do you look for either in the live source code or in the archive site?
I don't know if you want to answer, Giulia, or shall I go ahead?
I mean, you can go ahead and then I can maybe.
I was going to say I was especially lucky when I started the quality assurance process, because everything that the Emerging Formats Group had done and the UK Web Archive meant that I had everything pretty much intact with instances as far as they were concerned. They were already collected. So for me personally, as I was going through, it was a case of opening up the capture and then comparing it to the live site. And in the cases with style sheets, it would often be, oh, the font's not loading correctly. It should be based on the capture. And then you go into the live site, and that's when you find that there's links to external style sheets based in the source code. So it became a lot of opening the inspection tool on many different browsers just to make sure. And it can be surprising. There'll be things included that you think would be self-hosted by the artist or by the creator because it's an integral part of that work. But then you find out that it's actually part of a code that was written by somebody else and say uploaded on GitHub, which they've then used because they don't have that particular coding expertise. And it can be interesting in that way, seeing how things can be cobbled together. I know as a coder, I'm guilty of it sometimes where I need something to happen on a website that I can't code myself, so I'll find reliable source code elsewhere. And I think that's the inherent part, is you need to inspect just to see if there's any pesky little links hidden away.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of was about to say the same thing. It's kind of trial and error as well, and checking quality assurance and see what doesn't work, comparing it to the live website. Also with the annotation curation tool, W3 Act that we're using, and the Wayback Machine, it kind of, when you are assessing the quality of a capture, it will kind of tell you if something is missing, in terms of if you click through something, it will say like, oh, this link has not been captured because it links to something different, and you will see a different kind of URL, and then you will think like, oh, okay, that's missing. And then also kind of recrawling, adding that link and see if anything happens, if that's enough to kind of complete the capture or not. But it's kind of exploring and trying different things and see how much of it you can capture, basically.
Okay, there's also a follow-up question from Megan. Can you explain a bit about your background and how you narrowed in on interconnectivity being the problem? It makes so much sense explained in the terms you use, but from a web archivist who is not a native programmer or web developer, it's sometimes difficult to make these connections.
Okay, so my background is actually pretty varied. I started out as a graphic designer and then sort of graduated towards multimedia design. And from there is where I learned coding, or the basics of coding, outside of what I'd learned when Neopets was a thing and I got introduced to HTML. So that's my background there. I then went into creative writing from that stage. And the interconnectivity came from research in experimental literature. There's a very common theory within that with Deleuze and Guattari about rhizome theory, the idea that a fair information hierarchy wouldn't have a hierarchy at all. It would display it all interlinked. And once you've got that sold in your brain and you start approaching the internet, you can understand that the internet is a rhizome structure. So you need to check out every internet work, because if it's been designed with the internet in mind, the possibility of it having a hyperlink somewhere else is increasingly high. It's part of what makes the web beautiful, is that you can exchange information very quickly, sometimes with just a click of a button. But when it comes to putting something like that in an archive where it's isolated by nature, you suddenly lose quite a lot of operability. But that was my background and how I made all the connections.
You, Giulia, did you want to add to that at all?
I mean, I think Tegan was pretty exhaustive, actually. But yeah, it was, I mean, I think it's the idea of kind of interoperability. It's key in a lot of the emerging formats that we've been looking at, and the idea of, yeah, it kind of extracting it from its interlinked environment and putting it into the archive is something that we always have kind of on our mind, and making sure that we retain the kind of the meaning of the publication, even if we put it into a different kind of separated environment. It's part of what Stephen was also talking about before, about not just collecting one thing, but collecting the stuff around the thing, so to make sure that it still has meaning, and it can be understood in the future as well.
Thank you. The next question is for Bostjan. How responsive did you find the creators of the raw material and source code you were attempting to acquire from the Slovenian Computer Museum collections? Were any surprised to be contacted by a museum?
Thanks for the question. I think, yes, everybody's surprised to be contacted by a museum. It's a rare event in the universe, I guess, for a lot of people. And then the follow-on reactions are mostly either sad because I just threw that away last summer, or sad or guilty because no, I didn't keep proper backups, or mad because my employer destroyed those virtual machines that this was running on. And then occasionally you get, yes, of course, the laptop is right here. And like let's say 10% of people are fortunate enough to keep proper backups somewhere handy, and they're more than happy to hand it over. Basically, they've waited their whole life for this opportunity, and they were willing to keep that in the closet for the next 50 years until some other museum showed up. So I think it's just a matter of time. What gets people confused is that the passage of time and online is just so much faster, and 10 years old project is sometimes museum worthy. It doesn't have to wait until you're like 80 plus. That's the surprising realization for most of them. But yeah, otherwise it's mostly just sadness.
Thanks for that. The next question is for Natalie and Stephen. Yesterday, we had a researcher, Andreas, interested in how to preserve and provide access to apps. His questions may apply here. Has anybody pursued or made deals with intermediate aggregators of software applications, i.e. app stores? Was it necessary in your work to deal with third-party app creators?
It's a great question. We have dealt with them somewhat in that practical vision in terms of when we've tried to acquire apps at the V&A. We look specifically more at institutions who tried to acquire apps individually, so kind of individual case studies, a little bit in some of our literature review, and then as part of the case studies. We kind of know that they also keep a Hewlett acquired Planetary, that Memory acquired Biophilia, but it's more specifically where they've worked with individual app creators. But then we at the V&A have acquired two apps, I think, technically. So the first was Wechat. So we acquired the social network Wechat, which was that we worked obviously more in collaboration with Tencent to do that, and that was quite an interesting conversation that we had with them, specifically because the biggest concerns that we had around that was trying to preserve the kind of what the essence of Wechat was in terms of understanding its kind of the design of it as this kind of platform in which it folds in all of these multiple apps into one particular kind of centralized app, but also try to preserve some sense of like the user and what the user is. And that means having to understand, negotiate user-generated content in some ways. But obviously, we cannot, acquiring user-generated content is an absolute minefield, because to acquire someone's kind of life in that sense, it was very difficult. So we actually had to create a fake user with Tencent called Star, which unfortunately there is a level of negotiating curatorial autonomy there, and that has become a little bit of a difficult territory when you're working directly with a big company like Tencent to do that. And that often becomes the case, and we think it's going to become the case in order for you to get access to those apps and the preservation capacity for those apps to work with those bigger companies. Means that there is this kind of almost this moving of the dial between like what access you get compared to what autonomy you get sometimes in terms of the access. But in terms of working with something like Google Play Store, for instance, or working with the App Store, the nearest we've got to it is when we try to acquire Flappy Bird. So we have acquired Flappy Bird. I think we eventually went to Dongin to get that specifically. But I think we've downloaded it from Google Play first, or tried to before it then went off, and we've had some conversations with them, but they don't tend to really be interested in talking to heritage institutions. It's not really a conversation that bothers them. And we found that from talking to bigger companies, it's that they have their own corporate archives and they have their own corporate structures, and from doing kind of research and around this with individuals and people that we've talked to, there are corporate structures obviously that exist in corporate archives, but there's not often in the interest. This is why it kind of goes back to that conversation around policy that I was talking about. But people have been trying, obviously looking at, I have to go back and watch a presentation to find out how people have been trying to archive apps specifically. But there's the thing that we're more interested in is around how what is that kind of conversation around preserving that specific thing and the relationships you have to foster or you have to work with specific providers or companies, or whether you can, because we as a museum like to tend to talk to the creator in order to get that richer relationship and that rich context. But how that then comes with the preservation as well is quite tricky. I don't know if you want to mention anything about that, Stephen, at all.
I have zero experience with app collecting, but just in the VR case study, we found that our relationship with the maker, Marshmallow Laser Feast, for that VR case study, I think that was the kind of transformative factor in success depth or failure depth for that process, because that relationship with the maker, without that being as great as it turned out to be, and they were incredibly helpful and supportive to a level we would never have expected. Without that, it would have really been a much different proposition. So I've got no experience collecting apps, but it's clear to me that some of these successes will hinge on the relationship you can form with the creator, and maybe the rights holder and the creator being the same person makes everything nice and easy. Maybe it gets much more complex in bigger corporate context, but yeah, that's a VR case study insight, not an app as such.
Thank you. Okay, another question for Natalie and Stephen. What was the most complex acquisition that was in your test cases and why? Secondly, did you have any web archives specifically or social media content? What was complex about collecting web-generated content?
Instagram, like 100% Instagram. And we chose to include a speculative case study within our project because we wanted to test very much the boundaries of what our understanding around digital objects were. And obviously, Instagram itself is it's an app. It's now a website. It's also a digital cultural phenomenon, whatever you want to call it. And we wanted to look specifically at if we wanted to acquire it, if we were going to look to acquire it, what would that mean for institutions? Beyond just kind of obviously the collection policy is important to institutions. That's always going to be important because it would define why people wanted to acquire it. But there was a really great quote that we kind of made the headline of one of the chapters from a participant, Lisanna Rossi, who's done some really great work around multiple subjects in this area. So it was basically saying it's not an object. Like it's, I think even she's borrowed Tegan's work. I think that Lisanna may have said it's a rhizome, or it's a rhizomatic way of thinking about it, because it has all these multiple components and ways of thinking about it, and it made a very the problem is that we do have to archive it. We need to be preserving and capturing it, but it highlights every single possible problem there is with digital collecting, that there is in this current contemporary moment. Either it's to do with platform infrastructures, it's to do with the fragility of networks, it's to do with genre content, it's to do with immutability, it's to do with transformation of how we understand multiple issues to do with, like, I don't know, the fact is that if you look at Instagram in 2011 to 2016 to now, they're fundamentally different objects. But we have to be looking at acquiring those different things. But the access you get from Instagram is just absolutely null. And I think it's quite interesting for us to rather than kind of shy away from that, to provoke a number of different research opportunities or archiving projects to try and kind of see what can be done there. And then the report kind of goes into a few details about what could be possible. But obviously we know it's absolutely impossible without there being some negotiation of policy to gain access into that. That's my very short thing. But a lot of it actually is like the fact that lots of communities are acquiring it for themselves, and there are those people who are just kind of pulling their own archives and stuff, or pulling their own stuff. And what does that mean for institutions to take in people's internal archives? But yeah, I don't know, it's very difficult. This is the issue with this, I think, the wider project of archiving, or preserving. But
and just to add to that, Natalie, I mean, the Instagram case is so complex that when we made the decision model, you could spend a year making a decision model only about Instagram. It's so vast. And you know, the key headline questions are really, it's a data set, it's a vast data set, but also if you acquire only a data set, you don't acquire Instagram, because it's it's a constantly evolving data set that includes removal as well as addition and augmentation and interaction constantly on a global basis. So what are you trying to acquire? Is it a data set? Is it a permanently growing data set? And then it's an application that interacts with a data set that has versions that change through time and so on. And then it's user data with GDPR implications and et cetera, et cetera. It's so vast, it becomes a 5-year project just to model the decisions for Instagram alone.
But this is where we kind of pull towards that. This is where the kind of role of curatorial can be quite interesting in terms of defining, like, I mean, we've talked quite a bit, Stephen, I know that we have, and I know that at the V&A we've talked around the idea of, and Bostjan also talked about the idea of video game captures. So the idea of where we see these spaces as more performances and performative, like, and the idea of capturing and moving towards social history models to capture these spaces where, because we have this absence of all these problems with data, or these problems with archival models that are problematic or difficult, we can move, obviously we're having to move towards social history models to capture this history. And how do we just kind of use those while we kind of as alternative structures while we're trying to figure the other one out? And obviously we are still doing that in many ways, but yeah, it's super interesting.
Okay, I have time for just one last question. This one's for Tegan. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of W3 Act in your workflow? How and when do you use it? Is there limitations?
So with the quality assurance process, W3 Act was pretty much exclusively used to view instances. And the beauty of it is it would provide details about when the instance was made. And I think that was pretty much it for my work, though I did do some targeting, but it's really Giulia and the UK Web Archive team that have the expertise in that area. I was introduced to the platform and compared instances and not much else. So I don't know if Giulia would like to talk about how it's used at length.
Maybe just very briefly. Yeah, so we kind of use ACT both for like targeting the website that we decided to collect initially, and also to add the metadata to every captures, well, every targeted URL, kind of adding things like a short description. We kept it very short for the new media writing prize collection, and just kind of specified if something, if a specific work was shortlisted or won the prize and in which year, which was actually quite useful in the end, because we did divide the collection by year, because otherwise it was almost impossible to navigate with the amount of work that the collection had. And then, yes, it was also used for quality assurance. So for Tegan's placement, it was very useful to have everything in one place and be able to kind of compare the different captures and check if a website has changed through time, but also which capture were more effective than others and why. So it was kind of used throughout the process, I would say, both building the collection and kind of checking the collection and maintaining the collection as well.
Thank you. I want to thank all the panelists for their presentations and everything we've learned talking with them today. And thank you to the audience for submitting great questions. If you have any additional questions for the speakers, there is a channel in Slack where you can continue the conversation.